The relentless howling of the Chicago wind rattled the thick glass of the emergency room doors. Sarah rubbed her aching temples, wishing she had grabbed a second cup of black coffee. It was a brutal Friday night shift, one she had volunteered to cover because going back to an empty penthouse felt worse than the chaos of the hospital. Her husband, Mark, was on another endless business trip in Seattle, or so she thought. The sterile scent of antiseptic usually grounded her, but tonight, an undeniable heavy dread hung in the cold air. The radio on the nurse station crackled to life, announcing an incoming pediatric trauma. A 5-year-old girl with severe respiratory distress. Sarah adjusted her stethoscope and took a deep breath. She had been a pediatrician for over a decade, handling countless emergencies, yet her heart raced. She walked toward the ambulance bay, the flashing red and blue lights painting the snowy pavement in frantic strokes. The doors burst open, letting in a blast of freezing winter air. Paramedics rushed the stretcher inside. Sarah stepped forward, slipping into her professional armour, ready to save a life. She had no idea her own life was about to be completely destroyed. Sarah and Mark had been married for 10 years. They met in college, building a picture-perfect life in a luxury downtown Chicago condo. Mark was a regional sales director for a massive medical supply company, a job that demanded he travel constantly. Sarah spent her days healing other people's children, quietly carrying the heavy burden of her own infertility. They had tried everything: the treatments, the endless doctor visits, the silent tears in the middle of the night. Mark had always been supportive, telling her that they were enough for each other. He claimed his endless business trips were just a necessary sacrifice to secure their financial future. Sarah trusted him completely. She buried her maternal grief in her work, becoming one of the most respected pediatric emergency doctors in the city. She thought they were a solid team, weathering the storm of childlessness together. She believed her husband was her safe harbour. She never suspected that his frequent absences were not about securing their future, but about hiding an entirely different life. The chaotic symphony of the emergency room faded into a dull hum as Sarah focused entirely on the small patient. The little girl was pale, her chest heaving with every desperate attempt to pull oxygen into her tiny lungs. A young woman, likely the mother, trailed closely behind the stretcher, her face stained with dark mascara and tears. She was sobbing hysterically, clutching a pink winter coat. Sarah immediately barked orders to the nursing staff, directing the stretcher into Trauma Bay 1. The bright surgical lights snapped on, illuminating the grim reality of the situation. Sarah leaned over the child, her skilled hands swiftly assessing the airway and listening to the weak, rattling breath through her stethoscope. Severe pneumonia, possibly complicated by an underlying condition. Time was running out. She needed a complete medical history right now. Sarah turned to the frantic mother, her voice calm but authoritative. She asked for the girl's name, allergies, and recent medications. The mother stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence through her panic. She just kept pointing toward the waiting room doors, crying out for her husband to come inside. The heavy double doors of the trauma bay swung open with a violent thud. A man rushed into the room, his expensive wool coat speckled with melting snow. He was out of breath, his eyes wild with a primal panic. He rushed straight to the weeping young woman, wrapping his arms around her trembling shoulders. Sarah did not look up immediately. Her attention remained locked on the child, administering a breathing treatment to stabilize the small lungs. She needed the father to answer her questions since the mother was entirely incapacitated by fear. Sarah spoke loudly over the hiss of the oxygen mask, asking the man for the little girl's medical background. The man froze. The entire room seemed to lose its gravity. He slowly turned his head toward the doctor treating his daughter. Sarah finally lifted her gaze from the hospital bed. The harsh, fluorescent lights beat down mercilessly on them both. The clipboard in Sarah's hand slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly against the cold linoleum floor. It was Mark, her husband, the man who was supposed to be 3,000 miles away in Seattle. For a terrifying moment, the universe simply stopped expanding. Sarah stared into Mark's terrified brown eyes, the eyes she had kissed closed just 3 days ago. the eyes that had promised her a lifetime of devotion. His face went entirely pale, draining of all colour. He looked like a ghost trapped in the glaring light of the trauma room. The young woman beside him clung to his arm, completely unaware of the apocalyptic collision of worlds happening right beside her. She buried her face in Mark's chest, sobbing loudly. Mark did not hug her back. His arms hung limply at his sides as he stared at his wife. Sarah felt a ringing in her ears, a high-pitched scream of adrenaline and shock. The air in the room felt thick, like she was drowning in freezing water. Her mind desperately tried to construct a logical explanation. A brother he never mentioned. A kidnapping. A massive, elaborate misunderstanding. But the horrible truth was already settling like lead in her stomach. The 5-year-old girl on the bed looked exactly like him. She had his nose, his jawline, his dark curly hair. The math was impossible to ignore. Years of rigorous medical training overrode the catastrophic collapse of her personal life. A monitor beeped frantically, signalling a drop in the child's oxygen levels. Sarah tore her eyes away from her cheating husband and focused violently on her patient. Her hands moved with mechanical precision. She adjusted the oxygen flow, ordered an immediate portable chest X-ray, and pushed intravenous antibiotics. Every second counted. She could not let this innocent child suffer, even if the child was the living proof of her ultimate betrayal. Mark tried to take a step toward her, his mouth opening to speak, but Sarah shot him a look so filled with raw hatred that he stumbled backward. She pointed a shaking finger toward the corner of the room. She commanded him to sit down and shut up. The authority in her voice brooked no argument. The young mother looked up, confused by the doctor's aggressive tone, but Mark quickly pulled her into the corner chairs. Sarah spent the next 40 minutes pulling the little girl back from the edge. She saved the life of her husband's secret daughter, while her own soul was being torn into shreds. Once the little girl was stabilised and breathing comfortably, the nursing staff prepared to transfer her to the paediatric intensive care unit. Sarah stepped out into the quiet, sterile hallway to sign the digital chart on her tablet. She leaned against the cold white wall, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Her lungs burned. She felt like she was going to vomit right there on the polished floor. 5 years. This child was 5 years old. That meant Mark had been living a double life for over half a decade. Every anniversary, every Christmas, every time he held her, as she cried over another failed fertility treatment, he already had a family. The betrayal was so massive, so intricately woven into the fabric of her reality, that she felt like she was losing her mind. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, heavy, hesitant footsteps. Mark emerged from the trauma bay, his face twisted in a pathetic mask of sorrow and guilt. He reached out his hand, whispering her name. Sarah flinched as if he held a loaded gun. She pressed her back against the wall, her eyes wide like a cornered animal. Sarah held up a trembling hand, forbidding him from taking another step. Mark ignored it, pleading in a hushed, desperate whisper. He told her he could explain everything. He said it was a mistake that got out of control. Sarah laughed, a broken, hysterical sound that echoed off the hard hospital walls. "A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You do not accidentally maintain 2 households, fake hundreds of business trips, and raise a child for 5 years by mistake." Mark looked at the floor, the weight of his monstrous deception crushing him. He confessed that he met Chloe at a trade show. She got pregnant. He wanted to do the right thing for the baby, but he could not bear to lose Sarah. He blamed Sarah's delicate emotional state over her infertility. He said he was protecting her. That single sentence broke the final string holding Sarah's sanity together. He was using her trauma as an excuse for his cowardice. She stepped right up to him, her voice low and deadly. She told him that their marriage was over. She told him to go back to his real family. The rest of the night passed in a dizzying blur. Sarah handed the rest of her shift over to a colleague, citing a sudden personal emergency. She walked out of the hospital into the freezing Chicago morning. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, burying the city in a blanket of blinding white. She climbed into her SUV, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. She drove aimlessly for hours, the heater blasting, the radio silent. When she finally arrived at their luxury downtown penthouse, the silence of the empty space was deafening. The expensive modern furniture, the abstract art, the carefully curated life they had built together. It was all a hollow movie set, a museum of lies. She walked into the kitchen and picked up a heavy crystal vase that Mark had bought her for their 7th anniversary. With a primal scream that tore her throat, she hurled it against the marble island. The crystal shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. It felt incredibly good. She grabbed plates, glasses, anything she could reach, and smashed them onto the hardwood floors. She destroyed the illusion. By the time the sun had fully risen, the apartment looked like a war zone. Sarah sat in the middle of the destruction, completely exhausted. There were no more tears left to cry. Her heart had hardened into a cold, unbreakable stone. She walked into the master bedroom and pulled a large suitcase from the closet. She packed only what she needed: clothes, important documents, her favourite books. She left behind all the expensive jewellery Mark had bought her. Blood money, she thought bitterly. She called a real estate agent and a divorce lawyer before noon. She left a brief, emotionless note on the kitchen counter, instructing Mark to contact her attorney and to never try to call her directly again. She grabbed her keys and walked out the door without looking back. She knew exactly where she needed to go. She needed to escape the suffocating concrete of Chicago. She needed the grounding reality of nature. She pointed her car north, heading toward the dense, snowy forests of Wisconsin. Her father owned a rustic cabin near the lake. It was the only place in the world where she felt truly safe. The drive took 5 hours. The towering skyscrapers faded into endless flat fields, and finally into dense pine forests heavily laden with fresh snow. The roads grew narrower and more treacherous, but Sarah drove with a fierce determination. She finally pulled into the long, unpaved driveway of her father's property. The wooden cabin sat peacefully among the ancient trees, smoke lazily drifting from the stone chimney. Thomas, her father, was on the porch, wearing a thick flannel jacket and holding a mug of steaming coffee. When he saw her car, his face broke into a warm, welcoming smile. But as Sarah stepped out of the vehicle, the facade she had maintained for the entire drive instantly crumbled. The moment she saw her father's kind eyes, the dam broke. She ran to him, burying her face in his chest, sobbing like a terrified child. Thomas did not ask any questions. He simply wrapped his strong, weathered arms around his daughter, holding her tight against the biting winter wind. He guided her inside, into the comforting warmth of the crackling fireplace. Inside the cabin, the scent of burning cedar and brewing coffee wrapped around Sarah like a heavy blanket. She sat on the worn leather sofa, staring blankly into the flames. Thomas handed her a mug of hot tea and sat quietly beside her. Piece by piece, Sarah explained the nightmare. She told him about the hospital shift, the sick child, and the devastating revelation of Mark's secret family. Thomas listened without interrupting. His jaw tightened, his eyes reflecting a deep, protective anger, but his voice remained incredibly gentle. He told her that Mark's betrayal was a reflection of his own broken character, not a measure of Sarah's worth. He told her she was allowed to be furious, to grieve, to fall apart completely. "You are safe here, kiddo," he whispered, patting her trembling hand. "Take all the time you need. The world can wait." That night, lying in her childhood bed under a thick quilt, Sarah felt the first tiny spark of peace she had experienced in days. The absolute silence of the snowy woods was a stark contrast to the loud, chaotic wreckage of her life in the city. The next morning, the Wisconsin air was painfully crisp. Sarah woke up early, determined to channel her lingering rage into something physical. She dressed in heavy winter boots and a thick coat, stepping out into the blinding white yard. Near the woodshed, a large pile of uncut logs waited. Her father usually split them himself, but today Sarah needed the exertion. She grabbed the heavy steel splitting axe. It was awkwardly heavy in her hands. She placed a large pine log on the chopping block, raised the axe high above her head, and brought it down with a fierce grunt. The blade hit the wood at a terrible angle, bouncing off and jarring her arm so badly her teeth rattled. She cursed loudly, frustrated by her own weakness. She tried again, and again. Each failed strike only amplified the swirling storm of anger and inadequacy inside her. Why could she not do anything right? Why could she not give her husband a child? Why could she not even chop a stupid piece of wood? She dropped the axe and fell to her knees in the snow, covering her face as fresh bitter tears froze against her cheeks. "Excuse me, do you mind if I give you a few pointers on your swing?" The deep, calm voice startled Sarah so badly she jumped. She wiped her face frantically and looked up. A tall man with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard stood at the edge of the property line. He was wearing faded jeans and a dark green canvas jacket, carrying a toolbox. He held his hands up in a peaceful gesture, offering a gentle, apologetic smile. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, stepping closer. "I am David, Thomas's neighbour. I live in the cabin down the road." Sarah sniffled, embarrassed to be caught having a total breakdown over a piece of firewood. "I'm Sarah," she muttered, refusing to meet his eyes. "I am just visiting." David nodded slowly, his eyes taking in her tear-stained face and the discarded axe. He did not offer empty platitudes or ask intrusive questions. Instead, he simply walked over, picked up the axe, and demonstrated a fluid, effortless swing. The heavy log split perfectly in two. "It is all about the hips," he said softly, handing the axe back to her. "Not the arms. Try it again. I promise it helps." Sarah hesitated, then took the axe. She adjusted her stance, mimicking David's movement. She swung, driving her weight through her hips. The blade bit deep into the wood with a satisfying crack. A genuine surprise laugh escaped her lips. "That felt surprisingly good," she admitted, wiping sweat from her forehead. David smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "There is a lot of cheap therapy in splitting wood," he noted quietly. They spent the next hour working side by side, in comfortable silence. David stacked the wood while Sarah chopped, her anger slowly transforming into physical exhaustion. When they finished, Thomas emerged from the cabin with a thermos of hot cider. He greeted David warmly, treating him like an old friend. "Come sit on the porch with us," Thomas offered. They sat on the wooden steps, watching the snow fall over the frozen lake. Sarah studied David discreetly. He had a quiet, sturdy presence. There was a profound sadness in his eyes, a familiar shadow that Sarah immediately recognized. It was the look of someone who had survived their own personal apocalypse. Over the next few weeks, David became a constant, comforting presence. Sarah learned that he was an architect who worked remotely, preferring the solitude of the woods to the noise of the city. One frigid afternoon, while they were sitting on his porch drinking dark roast coffee, the conversation turned serious. Sarah finally shared the entire story of Mark's betrayal. She spoke about her infertility, the shame she carried, and the horror of discovering the secret child. David listened intently, staring out into the tree line. When she finished, a heavy silence hung between them. Then David took a deep breath and looked directly at her. "I understand more than you think," he said softly. "I was married for 6 years. We had a beautiful little boy. When he was 3, he got sick and needed a blood transfusion. That was when I found out my blood type did not match. Further testing revealed that I am completely sterile. I always have been. My wife had been having an affair. She took the boy and moved across the country. I lost my marriage and my son on the exact same day." Sarah gasped, her heart breaking for the gentleman sitting beside her. The sheer cruelty of his situation mirrored her own. They had both been discarded, punished for a medical reality they could not control. They sat there on the porch, two broken people sharing the warmth of a fire and the weight of their shattered pasts. In that shared vulnerability, a deep, silent bond began to form. Sarah realized that she was not damaged goods. She was just a woman who had trusted the wrong man. As the harsh Wisconsin winter slowly began to thaw, giving way to the gentle blooming of spring, Sarah felt her own spirit begin to heal. She finalized her divorce over video calls, selling the Chicago penthouse and splitting the assets. She officially resigned from her chaotic hospital job. She did not want to go back to the life Mark had poisoned. Instead, she started looking for a fresh start. She wanted to open a small pediatric clinic in a quieter, suburban neighborhood, and she knew she wanted David in her life, not just as a neighbor, but as something much more profound. Months passed, and Sarah purchased a beautiful historic townhouse in a quiet suburb, just outside of Milwaukee. It had a wraparound porch and a large garden filled with blooming lilac bushes. David helped her move, driving his truck back and forth from the cabin. Their friendship had blossomed into a careful, tender romance. There were no games, no hidden agendas. They communicated with a raw honesty born from their shared trauma. One evening, standing on her new porch under the warm glow of string lights, David pulled her close. He looked into her eyes with an intensity that took her breath away. "I know we both have scars," he whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "But I want to build something real with you. Something built on absolute truth." Sarah leaned up and kissed him, tasting the promise of a future she thought she had lost forever. The darkness of the past year melted away in his embrace. She knew with absolute certainty that leaving Mark and driving into the snowy woods was the best decision she had ever made. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, held right in the backyard of the townhouse. Thomas walked Sarah down the grassy aisle, tears of pure joy shining in his eyes. There were no extravagant decorations or hundreds of fake friends, just the people who truly mattered. As they exchanged vows, David held her hands tightly. "I promise to be your partner in every storm," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise that my heart will only ever belong to you." Sarah smiled, her soul completely at peace. After the wedding, they settled into a beautiful, quiet routine. Sarah opened her pediatric clinic, focusing on providing care to underprivileged families in the area. David designed custom homes from his home office. But despite their happiness, the quiet house sometimes felt too big. They both still carried the deep, unfulfilled desire to be parents. One evening, sitting by the fireplace, Sarah brought up a topic she had been researching for weeks. "Foster care adoption. We have so much love to give," she said softly. "There are kids out there who need a safe harbor." David smiled, squeezing her hand. "Let's do it." The foster care process was arduous and emotionally taxing. They underwent rigorous background checks, endless interviews, and weeks of training, but their shared resilience made them a perfect team. Finally, they got the call. A 2-year-old boy named Leo needed a permanent home. He had been bouncing around the system, deeply traumatized and terrified of the world. When the social worker brought him to their door, Leo was clutching a worn-out stuffed bear, his big brown eyes wide with fear. Sarah knelt down slowly, keeping her distance, and offered him a warm, gentle smile. "Hello, Leo," she whispered. "We are so happy to meet you." It took months of patience, sleepless nights, and unwavering consistency, but slowly the frightened little boy began to open up. The first time Leo called David Daddy, David had to leave the room to cry. They officially adopted Leo a year later. Their family was complete. They had built a beautiful, thriving life out of the ashes of their pasts. Sarah believed that all her major life surprises were firmly behind her. When Leo turned 3, Sarah began to feel strange. It started with an intense, overwhelming fatigue that no amount of coffee could cure. Then came the sudden aversions to food she usually loved. The smell of David brewing his dark roast coffee sent her running to the bathroom. At first, she brushed it off as a stubborn stomach bug, or the stress of running a busy medical clinic. But the symptoms persisted for weeks. She felt dizzy, irritable, and completely off balance. Panic began to set in. As a doctor, her mind immediately went to dark places. A tumour, an autoimmune disease. She remembered how her own mother had ignored symptoms until it was too late. Terrified that she was going to leave David and Leo alone, she secretly scheduled a comprehensive blood panel with a trusted colleague at the local hospital. She did not tell David about the appointment. She could not bear to worry him until she had the facts. She sat in the sterile exam room, gripping the edge of the paper-covered table, waiting for the devastating news that would ruin her perfect life. The door swung open, and her colleague, Dr. Evans, walked in holding a tablet. He looked completely baffled. He pushed his glasses up his nose and stared at Sarah. "Are you taking any new medications?" he asked, frowning deeply. Sarah shook her head, her heart hammering against her ribs. "No, nothing. Tell me the truth, Mark. How bad is it?" Dr. Evans let out a long, incredulous breath. He walked over and turned the tablet screen toward her. "Sarah, you are perfectly healthy. In fact, you are about 9 weeks pregnant." The room spun violently. Sarah grabbed the table to steady herself. "That is medically impossible," she gasped, the air leaving her lungs. "David is completely sterile. We have the lab reports. I am infertile. We know this for a fact." Dr. Evans smiled gently, shaking his head. "In medicine, we call things impossible until they happen. The tests are definitive, Sarah. You are pregnant, and everything looks perfectly normal." Sarah burst into tears, covering her face. It was not a tumour. It was a miracle, a tiny, impossible miracle growing right under her heart. Driving home that afternoon, Sarah felt like she was floating. The world looked brighter, the colours more vivid. She pulled into the driveway and saw David in the front yard, tossing a small football with Leo. The sound of her son's laughter echoed through the crisp autumn air. She parked the car and walked slowly across the grass, tears streaming down her face. David dropped the ball, immediately sensing the shift in her energy. He ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his face pale with worry. "What is wrong? What happened?" he demanded, scanning her face. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out the small, black and white ultrasound printout Dr. Evans had given her. She pressed it against David's chest. David looked down at the grainy image. He stared at it for a long, agonizing minute. His brain simply refused to process the information. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes wide and unblinking. Is this real?" He choked out, his voice cracking. Sarah nodded, laughing and crying at the same time. "It's ours, David! Against all odds." The pregnancy was a roller coaster of emotions. Because of their history, every tiny cramp or wave of nausea sent them into a panic. But as the months progressed, the baby grew stronger. David was fiercely protective, refusing to let Sarah lift anything heavier than a dinner plate. He painted the nursery a soft, warm yellow, building the crib with his own hands. Leo was thrilled, constantly kissing Sarah's growing belly and talking to his future sibling. He proudly announced to anyone who would listen that he was going to be a big brother. For David, the experience was profoundly healing. He had been robbed of the chance to experience a true, honest pregnancy with his first wife. Now he got to attend every ultrasound, hold Sarah's hand through every appointment, and feel the powerful kicks of his biological child against his palm. The universe had taken so much from both of them, but it was finally giving something extraordinary back. They spent the winter nights sitting by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling nothing but overwhelming gratitude for the life they shared. In late spring, just as the lilac bushes in the garden began to bloom, Sarah went into labour. It was a fast, intense process. David stood firmly by her side in the delivery room, whispering words of encouragement, holding her hand so tightly his knuckles were white. After hours of exhausting effort, the quiet hospital room was suddenly filled with the sharp, beautiful cry of a newborn. "It's a girl," the attending doctor announced with a massive smile. "A perfectly healthy little girl." They placed the tiny, red-faced infant onto Sarah's chest. She had a mop of thick dark hair and perfect tiny fingers. Sarah wept openly, pressing her lips against the baby's warm forehead. David leaned over them, his tears falling freely onto the pristine white hospital sheets. He traced the baby's cheek with a trembling finger. "Welcome to the world, Maya," he whispered softly. "We have been waiting for you for a very long time." In that sacred moment, surrounded by the beeping monitors and the smell of clean linen, all the pain of the past completely dissolved. When they brought Maya home, the house was filled with a chaotic, beautiful joy. Thomas had driven down from Wisconsin to help, immediately taking on the role of the doting grandfather. He rocked Maya to sleep in the old wooden chair, humming soft country tunes. Leo took his duties as a big brother very seriously, constantly bringing Maya his favourite toy cars and gently patting her head. One evening, Sarah stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching David hold their daughter. The soft glow of the nightlight illuminated his face. He was staring at Maya with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He looked up and saw Sarah watching them. "I never thought I would get to have this," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was broken." Sarah walked into the room and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his shoulder. "We were never broken," she replied quietly. "We just had to survive the wrong people so we could find our way to the right ones." They stood there in the quiet darkness, a family forged by fire and bound by unconditional love. A few months later, Sarah was out pushing the double stroller through the local park. The autumn leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold. She felt a deep, abiding peace in her soul. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was an unknown Chicago number. She hesitated, then answered. It was Mark. His voice sounded hollow, defeated, and much older than she remembered. "Sarah, I know I have no right to call," he said quickly, anticipating her hanging up. "But I heard through an old colleague that you had a baby. I just wanted to say congratulations. I am truly happy for you." Sarah stopped walking. She looked down at Leo, who was happily pointing at a squirrel, and Maya, who was sleeping soundly in her blankets. She felt no anger, no bitterness. The man on the phone was just a stranger from a lifetime ago. "Thank you, Mark," she said evenly. "I hope your daughter is doing well." There was a long pause on the line. "She is," he replied softly. "I messed everything up with you, Sarah. But I am glad you got the life you deserve. Goodbye." Sarah ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She did not feel the need to gloat or tell him about David. She simply took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air and kept walking. That evening, when they sat down for dinner, Sarah did not even mention the phone call. It was completely irrelevant to her reality. She watched David cut up Leo's chicken, laughing as the little boy told a wild story about a dinosaur at preschool. Maya was babbling happily in her high chair, smashing sweet potatoes onto her tray. This was her real life. It was messy, loud, and absolutely perfect. After dinner, they sat on the porch together, wrapped in thick blankets. David pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked out at the streetlights glowing in the evening mist. "I am thinking about how crazy life is," she said with a soft smile. "If I had never taken that extra shift in the emergency room, I would have never found the truth. And if I had never found the truth, I would have never found you." David tightened his arm around her shoulders. "Sometimes the worst day of your life is actually the beginning of the best part," he mused thoughtfully. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the distant sound of a passing train. They had both walked through the darkest valleys of betrayal and despair, but they had not let the darkness consume them. They chose to remain open, to risk the pain of trusting someone again. And because of that courage, they had built an unbreakable fortress of love. Sarah realized that the medical definition of infertility was just a word. It did not define her worth as a woman or her capacity as a mother. She was a mother to Leo, chosen and claimed. She was a mother to Maya, born of an impossible medical miracle. As the night deepened, Sarah rested her hand over David's heart, feeling its steady, reassuring rhythm. The nightmares of her past were entirely gone, replaced by the brilliant, beautiful reality of her present. She had finally arrived exactly where she was always meant to be. Over the next few years, Sarah's pediatric clinic thrived. She became a pillar of the community, known for her deep empathy and relentless dedication to her patients. She often drew upon her own painful experiences to comfort families facing impossible medical diagnoses. She knew what it was like to sit in a sterile room and feel the world collapse. Her ability to connect with grieving parents made her an exceptional doctor. David's architecture firm also expanded, allowing him to hire a small team and spend more time at home with the kids. They made it a rule to never work on weekends. Saturdays were reserved for long hikes in the nearby state parks, and Sundays were for messy pancake breakfasts and movie marathons in the living room. Every summer, They packed up the SUV and drove back up to the wooden cabin in Wisconsin. They wanted Leo and Maya to know the exact place where their parents' story truly began. Thomas loved having the house full of noise and laughter. He would spend hours teaching Leo how to fish on the lake, while Sarah and David sat on the porch, watching them with full hearts. During one of those summer trips, Sarah walked out to the woodshed behind the cabin. The old chopping block was still there, weathered by years of snow and rain. She picked up the heavy steel axe, remembering the furious, broken woman who had stood in this exact spot years ago. She smiled, shaking her head at the memory. David walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Planning on chopping some wood," he teased, kissing her neck. "I think my technique is pretty solid these days," Sarah laughed, leaning back against his chest. "But no, I was just thinking about how grateful I am that you decided to walk over here and interrupt my meltdown." David turned her around, looking deep into her eyes. "It was the best interruption of my entire life," he promised. They held each other in the quiet woods, surrounded by the smell of pine and the distant sound of their children playing. They had built a beautiful sanctuary out of their shattered pieces. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear, endless blue sky. The story of Sarah and David is a profound reminder that sometimes the universe has to tear down a false reality to make room for a genuine one. Betrayal is a uniquely devastating pain. It makes you question your own judgment, your worth, and your entire history. But it is not a life sentence. Sarah could have let Mark's deception destroy her ability to trust. David could have let his ex-wife's cruelty turn him permanently bitter. Instead, they took their broken pieces and built a new foundation based on absolute honesty. They chose love over fear, and in doing so, they unlocked a life more beautiful than anything they had ever imagined. Miracles happen when you create a safe space for them to land. Whether it is the miracle of opening your home to a terrified foster child, or the biological miracle that defies medical science, life always finds a way to balance the scales. The darkness never has the final word. As long as you keep moving forward, as long as you refuse to let your heart turn to stone, the sunrise will always come, and it will be breathtaking. Thank you for listening to this incredible journey of resilience, unexpected love, and impossible miracles. Sarah and David's story proves that the end of one chapter is simply the beginning of another, and the love we truly deserve will find us when we are ready. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever experienced a shocking twist in life that ultimately led you to a better place? Let us know down in the comments below. If you found this story inspiring, please hit that like button, share it with someone who might need a reminder of hope, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful cinematic stories. See you in the next video.